Sorry, cut the one side off of this, but this is another application in digital development that is really quite fascinating. It's fascinating because all of a sudden you have the online delivery and management of land records in Bangalore, India. So on Bhumi's website, they're using an open source or an open data management process to basically make land records available so that citizens know what services, where land management files are at. They can query civil servants. They can take any kind of discretionary or any kind of corruptive type of corrupt activity away from bureaucrats by saying, I looked this up on Bhumi and I've seen that this land has been registered under somebody else's name and it's our family land. So these are also forms of blogs or web pages where all of a sudden there's new efforts to create transparency and openness around data and its management. So on sites like this, you can see that all of a sudden the cloud is enabling us to, the internet and the cloud is enabling us to see things that perhaps were unseen before. This data is very interesting. Here we go back to the Facebook factor. The Facebook factor, as I mentioned, is omnipresent now through the world. We have 70% Facebook accounts outside of the United States, growing every day very rapidly. Their users, as I mentioned, are fastest growing. So the graph that's actually really interesting is the rate of change, the second block, where you see Africa growing. Now, this is no accident, of course, in relationship to recent events in North Africa. And I don't have the national data available, but what is interesting here is that you can see that Asia, certainly South America, Middle East, North Africa, Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean are well out there in front in terms of the rate of change. Market penetration in some areas, like Oceania, is quite saturated. In other areas, like Africa, it's just beginning. So guess where Facebook is looking for markets for its products? Guess what age group it's interested in? Users tend to be between 18 and 25. In many developing countries in Africa, you're talking about populations where close to 50% of the population is under the age of 15. And so user groups of 18 to 25 will still predominate this rate of change. One provision on this, or yeah, one proviso that I'd like to make on this data is that we have to look at Facebook accounts and any kind of Twitter or any other types of social media accounts with a bit of a big grain of salt, because as many of you know and some of you practice, people have more than one Facebook or Twitter account for one person. So one doesn't equal one. And this is very typical practice in the studies that have been done with Facebook in Southern Africa. So in Southern Africa, people have up to a dozen Facebook and email and Twitter accounts to use to be able to navigate their social relationships and their economic activities. So, I like this question. Poverty, development, we have an app for that. Or do we? Do we actually have an application for these really critical issues that we've been dealing with over the last 6 development decades? The reality is that we don't have the app entirely. There is potential. But as Powell states, something else is happening. Right now, the result of the investment by the development sector in building on the information communication and media technologies over the last 20 years. And many of you who work with NGOs know that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, on the NGO sites came Twitter feeds, RSS feeds, Facebook links. Join my Facebook, we're going to talk about women's health, perhaps video, generating content from the NGO, the development organizations. So all over the world, the development sector organizations have been very active in codifying their knowledge, putting it up and sharing it on the net. All of a sudden, they have become very information rich. And they are so much more richer than many of those who are still information poor. So they have become part of the haves and are moving further in distance from the information have-nots. So Powell is questioning this trend in development work. He's saying as digital development more exclusionary? Is it more exclusionary than what we've known development to be? And in other words, he says, are we actually on a new path of anti-developmental progress with the use of social media, with the convergence of many different kinds of media format? So there is a big question right now that is propelling a lot of the research in this field about whether or not we can have this app mentality to deal with poverty and development issues. So we're investing more and more in these systems, but really, have we gone back and learned about some of our past mistakes? And what are some of those past mistakes? Well, I think the best one that I've seen over my lifetime is that you can give more and more information out, or you can disseminate more and more information, but you may only be able to gain a fraction of actual behavioral change from that information. And that's one of the problems with information overload. We don't necessarily act and absorb and create knowledge from all the information that's around us. Human beings have interesting characteristics that make us actually turn off information cognitively, as well as willingly becoming distracted from information that we receive, and only changing or modifying our behavior to a certain extent. So we still have this issue in development activity where we use information and communication, that we actually may get information, but we may not really change our behavior. And when we do change our behavior, it may only be a partial change. So there's historically a poor response to information dissemination. Another big issue is that you have individuals in different contexts who are more likely to be attracted to certain types of media, whether it's radio or television or smartphones. In development work, we know from the last 30 years of studies on the ground, it's typically wealthier male users of information and communication technologies. To some extent, younger individuals, when they do have links to wealth, who may be interested in picking up on the technologies and assuming some of the risks with technologies. We know that risks themselves are quite diverse with information and communication. The risk that a user perhaps might be willing to assume is not the same as another individual. So a good example here is multi-purpose community telecenters, and we have someone here, one of our graduate students in capacity development extension, just finished her thesis on this topic. And in Eunice's work in Ghana with community telecenters, as well as a broader movement across the South, is that these telecenters have literally started to crumble. So if you're in urban and rural Africa right now, I would want to wager that these are highly unsustainable places that have become sometimes, only sustainable if there's a link to a hotel, if there is a link to a government institution next to a research institution next to a university. There has to be some kind of symbiotic relationship between these community telecenters. The public version of community telecenters, these MCTs, also exist in private form, and they're called cyber cafes. Cyber cafes, telecenters are highly unsustainable right now, and it reminds us that, in fact, many of the telecenters were placed there as ways of people welcoming people in as business, access to information, but not necessarily being able to deal with the underlying issues that people have and need solved in their day-to-day lives. So many of the so-called public telecenters became highly exclusive to certain types of users. These two websites are going to just reinforce the fact that while in the earlier information I was telling you about, that 89% of emails are spam, well, of the 255 million websites out there in the world today, over, I think just around 70% are in English, and other languages rapidly increasing, but not on web pages, more likely in Facebook and Twitter, etc. But one of the interesting things is that when we scratch the surface of content in the cloud or in the internet, we can also see some of the realities of social exclusion. One of them is very much related to gender. So Wikipedia just did a major study on its content. Less than 18% of Wikipedia content is authored by women or associated with women whatsoever. So there's an online discussion, and you could join that in the Wikipedia site, or trace the New York Times article on this topic about where are the women in Wikipedia. Why aren't women part of Wikipedia, and how did this structure come about that it was so supposedly be gender neutral, but has been gendered? So there's some good debate going on that side. The same kind of debate is happening in other parts of the world. With Fahamu and the Pamazouka news in Southern Africa, a lot of discussion is about the fact that most of what's on the internet is irrelevant to African society, that the way that societies are being projected in the age of digital development is very similar to past lessons with television and the stereotypic imaging of African societies and African people. So Fahamu and its network is building African content by Africans for Africans, trying to raise these issues and make the link between media and social justice. We have lots of myths to overcome from the 20th century in the 21st century for digital development to really have a new place in our scholarship, in our practical work. One of them is that there is a tendency to see that information equals development. This is lodged in that modernization mindset that I talked about earlier, about the fact that if we just have more and faster and greater quantities of and speed in information dissemination, that development will occur. And in fact, we know this is really false. We know that information is only potential development if it is part of a communication process. So in fact, whereas we could argue that communication equals development, information certainly doesn't. So digital development has to put less emphasis on information and more emphasis on communication as a bidirectional interactive process of human change and development. The next myth that needs to be overcome is that if you build it, they will come. We see that here in Ontario and in Canada, where if we simply enable ISPs through a favorable market system, if we build towers in rural Ontario, if we develop fiber optic cables when we are building roads in southern Ontario, if we build it, they will come. In fact, we know that this is not necessarily the case at all, and it's the same thing in the development context. Of course, there will be early innovators, individuals who have the means to be able to provide and join the digital context. But at the same time, these early innovators don't necessarily have the motivation for others to follow. And that goes back to the argument that in fact there are many have-nots and will-nots that don't associate it with others. I often use the example when I'm talking about the fact that I have a laptop, but I'd like a tablet. Or maybe I'd like to trade this in altogether and move to an entirely different system. Maybe I'll move from PC to Mac. These early innovators who adopt technology do this very rapidly. And the reality is that those who are entering technology with a much more simple or perhaps reluctant attitude will follow that progression of technology very differently. And therefore, we have to make very careful assumptions about if we simply build it, people will actually use them.